May 15th, 1904. Dreamland Amusement Park's opening day. Which attractions would you visit? Perhaps Professor Wormwood's Dog and Monkey Show. The famous Shoot the Chutes. How about a trip through the fall of Pompeii with fire and lava rendered in cycloramic glory? Or maybe the premature infant incubators. Wait, what? Yep, from its opening day until its tragic destruction by fire, and I am getting there, I promise. It's only been 2 years. You guys want me to rush this Dreamland Fire story? Anyway, from its opening day to its tragic destruction by fire, one of Dreamland's mainstay attractions was a room full of premature babies, nestled safe and sound in a true marvel of the age, a cast iron, steam-heated incubator box, and you could see them for only 25 cents. And the story of why these premature infants were in an amusement park and not, say, I don't know, a hospital, takes us through a strange tale of fraudulent identities, eugenics, medical prejudice, and even a peculiarly American variety of heroism and showmanship in the form of the man at the center of it all, Dr. Martin Cooney. Dr. Martin Cooney was born in Alsace-Lorraine, France in 1869. As a young man, he studied at the University of Berlin and then Leipzig, soon earning his medical degree. Hold on, I'm getting some late-breaking news. The above information is not true. It turns out that although Martin Cooney gave this biography for most of his life, it just wasn't true. Like, none of it. To put it bluntly, it's a lie, even though you can find some or all of it repeated in many modern-day books and articles right up to the present day. The medical degree and his French place of birth? Lies. So right from the beginning, let me state unequivocally, and you need to understand that I actually like this guy, and he is the hero of this story. Dr. Martin Cooney wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't French. Martin Cooney's name was actually Michael Cohen, and he was born in Krotoshin in modern-day Poland, then a part of Germany. So why the lies? Obviously, the fake medical degree, one of his later fabrications, served him professionally in the medical sphere, but I think there was a dark reason behind his earlier falsities. Michael Cohen was Jewish in the late 19th century in Germany. Unsurprisingly, for anyone who is familiar with, I don't know, history, things were getting rough for German Jews during this time period. Not that they had ever been easy, and the Jewish population of Cohen's hometown had already begun to leave, many emigrating to the United States. It's hard to sift through Cohen or Cooney's many biographical embellishments to find the truth, and beyond the few facts that I just laid out, it's impossible to say exactly how and when he came to the United States, but he became a naturalized citizen in 1898, and there is evidence that he was living in America up to 10 years earlier. Given the circumstantial evidence, it seems likely that Cooney had some bad experiences in his home country that he was eager to leave behind, and him trading in the all-too-Jewish last name was part of that transition. At this point, he decided to call himself Couney, which is definitely an interesting coincidence given where he will eventually wind up. Couney has a nice ring to it, and it's pretty tough to pin down any ethnicity or nationality associated with it, so it works well for a man eager to leave the past behind. Peering through the murk of Couney's mostly unknown early personal history, we'll have to content ourselves with a few unequivocal facts. And here's one of the earliest things we know for sure about this mysterious émigré. In 1896, he displayed his infant incubators probably for the first time at the Victorian-era exhibition in London. So what were these incubators and where did they come from, and how did Martin Cooney, mystery man from Poland, get his hands on them? Well, let's talk about premature babies. For most of human history, premature birth was rough. According to Don Raffel, author of The Strange Case of Dr. Cooney, prior to the late 19th century, parents of so-called weakling babies, That is, infants born early and weighing under 4 pounds often had to resort to traditional remedies to try to keep them alive. Remedies like placing the babies inside pots full of feathers or slathering them in olive oil, wrapping them in a sheepskin, placing them by the hearth to keep them warm, and, well, basically just hoping for the best. Most of the time, sadly, the best just didn't happen. Infant mortality was high across the board, even when the baby was born healthy. A weakling baby stood little chance. In the mid-1800s, declining European birth rates and an increasing trust in the wonders of science led several doctors to try to engineer a reliable way to keep these weaklings from dying. In Leipzig, an obstetrician named Karl Couney, and look, I'm going to try my best with these names, but it's not going to go great. Anyway, Karl Couney came up with a bed surrounded by a double wall of hot water. Water that had to be manually refilled. In 1878, the French doctor Etienne Tarnier tinkered with the design to automate the process of pumping in hot water, turning it into a bed with a tank of gas-heated water underneath. But his design, which he called the mother hen, proved dangerous, as there was a risk of the water boiling and basically turning the bed into, well, a pressure cooker bomb. Which is a bad way to keep babies alive, because it might explode them. In 1896, M. Alexandre Lion, a French engineer, exhibited his Child Incubation Institute at the Berlin Industrial Exhibition. His incubators used an improved steam method and hopefully less explodey boiler, and the small building housing the exhibit drew great crowds who began referring to it as, give me a second, the Kinderbrutenstalt, or child hatchery. Claire Prentice describes the incubators in her book, Miracle at Coney Island. The device replicated the body temperature of the mother, thereby keeping the infants warm, while simultaneously protecting the babies from germs circulating in the atmosphere outside. Babies typically stayed in the incubators until they reached a weight of around 5 pounds, which could take weeks or months, depending on their size at birth and their ability to feed. Fresh air from outside the facility was filtered and warmed before being carried inside the incubators by a large tube. Later, the huckster hero of our story, Martin Cooney, would claim that he was the one who exhibited the incubators in Berlin, but in fact, he and a partner contacted M. Lion about mounting an exhibit in London using these incubators at the Victorian Era exhibition. So how is this poor Jewish immigrant able to even consider mounting a show of premature infant incubators in England? I don't know. These gaps in his biography just haven't been filled in. But however he had gotten the money together, as well as the interest in putting babies in their incubators on display, he somehow managed to secure an empty corner of the exposition between a panorama of ancient Rome and the entrance to a railway ride. He had licensed the infant incubators from M. Alexandre Lion. He had secured the site, and now all he had to do was find some babies. For a Polish Jew testing out a newfangled contraption on what amounted to a midway, this wasn't easy. After finding the British public and medical establishment unwilling to offer up their weakling babies, he instead turned to France, where Lyon's earlier work had primed the public to be more willing to offer up their newborns to strange men in medical coats. Claire Prentice writes, on an otherwise unspectacular Paris spring day, he and Mademoiselle Louise Recht, the leading nurse specialist in premature infant care in Europe, if not the world, found themselves packing 3 wicker baskets with French babies and hot water bottles, and loading them into a cab. To get to England, he and Recht and their charges traveled first by train through France, and then across the English Channel by steamer. So the French babies arrived in England and were taken out of the baskets and placed into a hatchery. And they were a hit. And of course they were. I mean, babies are cute, and saving them is awesome. Thousands upon thousands of people filed through the child hatchery, and Michael Cohen, Martin Cooney, made bank. Almost immediately, Martin Cooney's exhibition caught the attention of imitators who noted how much money he was making for, to their eyes, showing off a bunch of babies in boxes. Soon, rival exhibitions sprang up throughout England. The Lancet noted that although Cooney's exhibition seemed sound, it attracted the attention and cupidity of public showmen and all sorts of persons who had no knowledge of the intricate scientific problems, and they started to organize baby incubator shows just as they might have exhibited marionettes, fat women, or any sort of catchpenny monstrosity. It is therefore necessary that we should at once protest that human infirmities do not constitute a fit subject for the public showman to exploit. Regardless, Cooney ended his run at the Victorian-era exhibition successfully and was headed back to his new home in Nebraska in the United States of America. Again, how long had he been living in Nebraska? Unclear, and frustrating. At any rate, Cooney, riding high on his success in London, now set his sights on the Trans-Mississippi and International Exposition opening up in Omaha in 1898. With 6 incubators he'd brought back from Europe, Cooney set up the new exhibit and immediately became the most cutting-edge facility in Nebraska and most of the U.S. for taking care of premature babies. Once the word got out about Cooney's upcoming exhibit, he didn't have long to wait before Nebraskans began contacting him about their own premature infants, many of whom he took in. Again, the baby exhibit was a success. It was at Omaha where he also met another important figure in Coney Island history, Fred Thompson, creator of the Trip to the Moon Dark Ride Cyclorama, which you can learn more about in this video. The two men were introduced to each other and hit it off. This will be important later on. So let's back up here for a minute. Why exactly did these preemie sideshows provide better medical care for their infants than legitimate hospitals? Why hadn't every major city's medical establishment jumped on the infant incubators as soon as they were shown to work? Part of it was that most doctors believed that the absolute best place for a baby, any baby, was with its mother, and not, say, in a steam-heated cast iron box. And sure, if we're talking about full-term healthy babies, yeah, don't stick them in the box, but premature infants haven't had time to develop the layer of baby fat that a full-termer has, and unfortunately that means the mother's body heat isn't going to be enough to keep the baby alive, and solutions like the pot full of feathers I mentioned before, while kind of ingenious, weren't fully up to the task either. The other reason medical men rejected the baby boxes was often far more insidious. With the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859, the concept of survival of the fittest had entered into the scientific milieu, and in many cases been twisted to justify pre-existing prejudices, including racism, homophobia, and ableism. By the late 1800s, Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, coined a term that would become used in conjunction with some of the worst faux scientific and medical abuses of the 20th century, including forced sterilization. That word was eugenics. The idea that those whom society deemed unfit, the mentally or physically disabled, people of color, Jews, non-heterosexual, or any number of other traits, should not reproduce. Soon, some American physicians were applying eugenics ideas to the question of whether or not premature infants should be nursed to health. As a Dr. W.S. Ranson wrote in 1898, "It is maintained by some that it is inconsistent with the best physical development of the men and women of our nation to rear these little creatures, it being assumed that they will have impaired physical vigor and transmit this to their offspring." In other words, it was in society's interest for the so-called weakling babies to, well, die. Eugenics wasn't a universal belief, but it was one that gained significant ground in the early to mid-20th century with horrific results. So, the combination of a skeptical medical community and the necessary cost of acquiring and implementing the new technology meant that few hospitals were willing to bring the incubators into their facilities. Perhaps ironically, the fact that Couney was making his name exhibiting the incubators at expositions, and his imitators in far less reputable environments, made the whole idea even less savory to the eyes of the establishment. After his successful exhibit in Omaha, Couney next set up his babies in boxes at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, where he had a chance to put his incubators into immediate action when an Apache woman named Ikishupa, who had been performing in the exposition's Indian pavilion, gave birth to a baby who weighed only 2 pounds. Also attending the fair was Couney's old friend, Fred Thompson, who excitedly told Couney about his idea for a new venture. The flight to the moon had been such a success that Thompson and his co-exhibitor, Skip Dundee, planned to turn it into a permanent attraction, and what's more, use it as the cornerstone for a complex of other amusements. An amusement park, if you will, similar to Steeplechase Park on Coney Island. In fact, Thompson and Dundee thought Coney Island was the perfect place for such a venture, and given how many people were showing up for Martin Cooney's incubators, perhaps he would like to join them and set up a facility at what they were going to call Luna Park. Couney took them up on their offer, and on May 16, 1903, Luna Park opened its gates to the American public, where they found a wonderland of castles, towers, submarine rides, and of course, flights to the moon, all lit by thousands of that latest wonder of the age, light bulbs. Nestled among the madness of what New Yorkers began calling Lunatic Park was a turreted building with a sign that read, "Infant Incubators with Living Infants." The oddity of the incubator building and its serious medical mission standing among the light bulbs and rides and street performers did not go unnoticed. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported, "When everything has been said, there is a strong flavor of incongruity and inappropriateness in its being there at all. The very idea of spielers and barkers standing before the doorway and haranguing the passing throng in an effort to divert its shekels for a spectacle so serious, not to say sacred, strikes one as questionable, almost repellent." However, inside, the visitor would find a spotlessly clean, sober scientific exhibit whose attendants were utterly devoted to the baby's well-being. Physicians in New York gained confidence in Couney. And actually, this is when Martin Cooney changed his name to its final form, Cooney, with a U, because Dr. Couney on Coney Island, I mean, come on. That's ridiculous. Anyway, New York physicians now took note of Cooney's seriousness and the fact that his techniques seemed to work. Cooney boasted an 87% success rate for nurturing the babies up to a healthy weight, far higher than the hospitals, and began sending him premature infants that their facilities could not care for. Cooney took them in free of charge. Parents never spent a penny to have their babies cared for. All costs were covered by the stream of visitors who eagerly plunked their quarters down to see Cooney's miracle at work. In fact, Cooney's exhibit was so successful, both in terms of baby survival and profitability, that the next year, when my beloved Dreamland Park opened, he set up a second incubator exhibit there, following that with a third location in Atlantic City. Cooney was riding high, saving babies and raking in cash. He got married and in 1907 welcomed his first child into the world. Appropriately enough, she was born 6 weeks premature. Cooney used one of his incubators to nurse her to health, and she thrived. Everything was humming along nicely and continued to do so until 1911, when the fire happened. The Dreamland Fire. At around 1 a.m. on May 27, 1911, an electrical fault in the Hellgate ride at Dreamland caused light bulbs to explode. The noise and sudden darkness startled a worker who was performing some repairs on the ride, causing him to kick over a bucket of hot tar, which immediately ignited the all-too-flammable materials used in 1900s ride construction. Soon, flames were leaping from Hellgate and blazing through the park. It was, in a word, a nightmare. And by morning, the entirety of Dreamland, except for the scenic coaster, had been reduced to ash, including the infant incubators. The New York Times reported, "The fire caused the death of 6 babies which have been on exhibition in the infant incubator show near the West 8th Street entrance. Sergeant Clink of the Coney Island station thought of the babies as soon as he learned of the fire and made a dash for the show. He got in and managed to get 3 of the tiny children out, only to find that all 3 had been suffocated to death. The flames spread with such rapidity that Clink could not get into the building again after having left it with the last of the 3 infants, and it is known that at least 3 other infants were left within the structure." An awful, awful tragedy. But I do have some good news for you. It wasn't true. As Claire Prentice describes in Miracle at Coney Island, what in fact happened was that the physician in charge that night, Dr. Fischel, heard the commotion and looked out a window. He called to the night nurse, Miss Graff. Together with the 2 wet nurses, they scooped the infants out of their incubators and hurried outside. Sergeant Fred Clink, the first policeman on the scene, spotted Fischel leaving the exhibit and went to help. Clink clutched one of the infants to his chest and led the way toward the exit, their path lit by the flames. Wearing only their nightclothes, the wet nurses wrapped the babies inside their robes. Dr. Fischel and the nurses brought the 6 babies to the home of a fellow physician who lived nearby, where they were placed into a bed. Miraculously, all 6 survived. The Times published a correction the next day, but, nobody reads the corrections, and Cooney had a full-on public relations disaster on his hands. If the medical establishment had begun to warm to him during the previous few years, the old guard now fully turned their backs on him and his incubators. Still, though Cooney's shows were reviled by physicians, they continued to capture the attention of the public. If the hospitals wouldn't have him, the fairs and expositions would. In 1914, there was finally some indication that this state of affairs might change. At this point, Dr. Cooney said that he had cared for some 6,000 premature infants, 5,100 of whom had survived, a record that the medical establishment had no choice but to notice. A young doctor named Julius Hess took note of Cooney's work and found it inspiring. Taking Cooney's incubator shows as an example, he established a facility for caring for premature infants at Sarah Morris Hospital for Children in Chicago and reached out to Cooney for advice and support, despite the contempt that most of the medical establishment held him in. He even made modifications to modernize the incubator boxes, including changing the heating system from gas and steam to electricity. In the 1920s, Hess continued to consult with Cooney as he published scientific articles on caring for premature babies, work which eventually culminated in a textbook published in 1928. Finally, with Hess's help, Cooney's ideas were pushing their way into the medical mainstream. In the 1930s, Cooney, now in his 60s, became concerned about events happening across the ocean. In 1936, the news was getting increasingly worrisome. Hitler was consolidating power, rearming Germany, and spreading his hatred of Jews in every possible forum. Cooney, who had more or less renounced his own Jewish identity when he came to the U.S., even going so far as to live in a suburb of Coney Island that barred Jews from owning property — he had his Catholic wife sign the paperwork — still had family in Germany and Poland, and he could see all too well which way the winds were blowing. In 1937, Martin Cooney, who had stood against the eugenic belief that weakling babies should be left to die and personally saved thousands of their lives, saw that Hitler's theories about Jewish people would inevitably lead to their destruction. He began writing to his relatives, sending them steamship tickets and money, and telling them that they needed to leave their homeland immediately, without even taking the time to pack. At least 15 of his European family members took him up on his offer for help, and thus escaped the horrors that would soon follow. In the 1940s, Cooney attempted to mount several exhibitions of his incubator and babies, but public interest was flagging, and the exhibitions cost far more to run than they took in. In 1943, after they'd been losing money for years, Cooney closed his exhibits at Luna Park and Atlantic City, as hospitals began to adopt the belief that premature infants should have a shot at life and installed their own incubators. The spectacle of incubator boxes at amusement parks became archaic. Cooney's services were no longer necessary. He retired the same year, deeply in debt. Unable to remain in his house, he spent his last few years in a nursing home before dying on March 1st, 1950 at the age of 79. Former incubator babies and their parents attended his funeral. By then, neonatal hospital units across the world were using incubator boxes of their own, based on the technology that he had helped to popularize, one amusement park exhibit at a time. Martin Cooney, whose name was actually Michael Cohen, who said he hailed from France but grew up in Poland, who claimed to be a doctor but never earned a medical degree, leaves us with many questions. Why did he change his name? Why did he give himself the unearned title of doctor and obscure his country of origin? We can make guesses, as I have, based on the few facts we know of his early life, but maybe in the end his complicated relationship with the truth is kind of irrelevant when it comes to his legacy. Ultimately, Cooney, or Cohen, was a man with a passionate belief in the idea that even the most helpless of infants, the weaklings whom so many others had consigned to death, whom many even considered a burden on society to keep alive, he believed that they could be saved and that they should be saved. At the time, he was dismissed as a mere showman, or even a huckster who exploited the babies to make himself rich, but it is clear from the trajectory of his life that he always put them first, that he made sure that his exhibit's priority was the care and nurturing of his charges, even when others who dabbled in this arena cut corners and put their fragile lives at risk, and that he was willing to stake his personal fortune on his work even when his exhibition model was no longer financially viable. In the end, Cooney's work was about the babies, and his work saved lives. All told, as many as 6,500 babies were nurtured in his incubators, 6,500 young lives that may have never had a chance if he had taken no for an answer when hospitals and doctors refused to use incubator boxes in their own facilities. If he hadn't been willing to instead set up shop at expositions, boardwalks, and amusement parks, under his own terms, of course, they never would have survived. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this program, please note that I do have a Patreon, patreon.com/Ty Bannerman. You can contribute if you'd like to see more of this work in the future. And thank you once again for meeting me in Dreamland.